U.S. officials say the drone attack on the Kremlin earlier this month was likely orchestrated by one of Ukraine's special military or intelligence units. But U.S. intelligence has, quote, low confidence, which is a specific category about their own conclusion, because they're not sure which Ukrainian unit may have been involved, according to a New York Times report. And the Times is reporting it was not clear whether President Volodymyr Zelensky or his top officials were even aware of the operation. This is the outspoken head of the mercenary Wagner group that suffered major losses in the prolonged Bakhmut engagement, says the Ukraine war has backfired and is warning of a Russian revolution. Joining me now is former CIA Director John Brennan. So let me ask you first about the drone attack. What is your thought reading this assessment? Excuse me.
Well, I'm pretty sure it was done by forces that are aligned with Ukraine, whether they were Ukrainian special forces operating inside of Russia. I think it appears as though this drone was not flown from Ukraine proper itself, but may have been launched in Russia. Whether they were Russian citizens who are very sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause, or some forces within the Ukrainian military special forces structure. But I think, as you noted, it's unclear whether or not President Zelensky had any prior knowledge of this or authorized it.
And of course, Ukraine has denied it. Also, Ukraine is reiterating its claim, as I say, that it had nothing to do with that drone attack, although they're not answering for what other of their supporters. There was also the noted assassination of the daughter of a very strong Putin advocate. There are other things that have happened, cross-border raids, that Ukraine has repeatedly denied, and that's supposed to be a red line. Certainly has been, in terms of the weapons that we provide them. There are also reports that this could be a false flag from Russia. Do you think that's likely?
I don't think so at all, because I think these attacks that are taking place inside of Russia are quite embarrassing to the Russian government and to Putin himself. It shows the vulnerability as well as the ability of his Ukrainian adversaries to penetrate Russian defenses. And so these attacks that are taking place inside of Russia's border near Ukraine, I think, again, are the activities of those individuals, Ukrainians and I think Russians, who have aligned themselves with Ukraine, that are angry and are determined to bring the fight into Russia after all the destruction that has taken place inside of Ukraine. So I expect these types of attacks to continue and, in fact, to increase in terms of scope and scale. As a way to, again, signal to the Russian people that the Ukrainians are not just going to sit back and take all of these attacks on their territory. They're going to bring the fight to Russia.
And turning to Bakhmut, of course, the founder of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, said that 20,000 Wagner Group fighters were killed in Bakhmut, his mercenary troops, and that his troops would be gone from Bakhmut by June 1st. He's also talking in an interview with a political operative and a blogger that Moscow's brutal war will plunge Russia into turmoil unless wealthy elites, his terms translated, become more directly committed to the conflict. So is this a fairly direct criticism of President Putin?
Well, it is, and I think Prigozhin, as well as Putin, have viewed the Wagner forces. These are the paramilitary forces that are manned by a lot of people who have been just, pushed out of prison, and they were considered to be expendable human chattel that were killed in the tens of thousands in the fight for Bakhmut. And I do think that Putin probably was trying to keep in reserve the Russian military forces, who are now going to take over some of those positions. But Prigozhin, I think, is trying to goad Putin into taking a much more aggressive and assertive position against Ukraine and to increase, in fact, the intensity of the war effort by calling for a full mobilization, as well as getting all Russian citizens involved in the manufacturing and production of ammunition and artillery shells and so on. So I do think Putin is feeling the heat from his right wing because the war effort has gone so poorly for the Russians, and that there's so many Russians have been killed as a result of Putin's war.
But his leadership is not really in question, despite the fact that the military, the organized military, and the mercenaries, this mercenary group, seem to be in disarray.
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any type of organized opposition to Putin at this point. You never know who might be waiting in the wings or what might happen. But I do believe that Putin sees this fight as existential in terms of he needs to have a military conquest of Ukraine in order to maintain his political position. So I think he sees it for his own political survival. And so there is a question about how long will the Russian people and even those in the higher echelons of the Russian government be willing to allow this war to continue to go along this path that I think is destined to lead to greater, in fact, destruction of Russia's military.